Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you joined me for a story tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and go and get yourself something lovely to drink. And if it's something unusual, let me know about it, because I really do love hearing from you. So let's get started with our story. Iris Penegram's small perky nose twitched with indignation. She shook her head of tightly cropped brown hair rather vigorously. She was wearing a sizable scowl on her face, as she was not remotely happy being here on this ridiculous camping trip out here in the Ozarks, being eaten alive by mosquitoes, who seemed to believe her skin was an all-you-can-eat buffet. She had been swatting the mosquitoes away since she had arrived here, and she couldn't fathom for the life of her how anyone thought camping could be fun when you had to put up with all this totally uncivilized nonsense. Iris's husband Ken had pitched their tent rather successfully around a prepossessing silvery lake, in the middle of nowhere it would seem, where the only sound she could hear was the shrieking cries of the wild ducks and the soft gentle tug of the cooling breeze that nuzzled her skin. She didn't feel remotely comfortable being out here. There wasn't a solitary soul around in this desolate, seemingly charmless place, for it made her feel conspicuously vulnerable. Ostensibly, anything could be out there in this wilderness, from a mountain lion to a bear, and even a deranged human being perhaps, who was intent on doing the family bodily harm, lying in wait to prey upon them. Iris had read enough stories over the years about campers going missing, never to be seen or heard from again, and their whereabouts never discovered. But she tried not to think about unsettling things like this, for it would mean another disturbed, sleepless night. She didn't want vivid nightmares on top of those nasty nippers feasting on her skin to deprive her of another good night's sleep. As far as Iris was concerned, there was always safety in numbers, so being around people and civilization was certainly a reassuring sanctuary for her. For if something were to happen to you, people would intervene on your behalf and likely help you by calling an ambulance or administering some kind of CPR. But here in the Ozarks, she and her husband, along with 14-year-old Jake, were at the mercy of this unforgiving wilderness. At least her husband and Jake were happy to be here, even though she knew she'd be as miserable as hell. But she would stoically grin and bear it, for that's what you do in circumstances like this. She certainly didn't want to ruin the fun her husband and Jake were having. So keeping an upbeat, positive attitude on this holiday was very important. She'd at the very least pretend to be enjoying herself, and that in itself was a tumultuous challenge. You would think that the spectacular view over the silvery lake would be a small consolation prize to Iris, but as far as she was concerned, there were no redeeming features about the Ozarks. The shimmering lake looked particularly beguiling under the glaze of the afternoon sun, where pretty life sharks sprinkled themselves magnanimously across the water, so that the surface twinkled like hundreds and hundreds of daytime stars. Then there were the giant-sized trees that swaddled the lake on every side, against a statuesque backdrop of stunning mountainous plateaus that were sublime to behold, and even Iris could not dispute that. She had agreed to come on this camping trip, as every year she and her husband Ken took it in turns to select where they would ultimately go on their yearly holiday destinations. Iris predictably chose expensive, frivolously extravagant, luxurious hotels, where fabulous shopping opportunities were the order of the day, while her husband Ken was drawn to sequestered camping sites in lonely, secluded areas such as this, that you probably wouldn't even find on a respectable-looking map, were you to look. Why the hell did Ken love roughing it like this? Iris would often ask herself. She loved her husband more than life itself, of course. She knew that this is where their similarities as a couple began and ended. Iris hated everything about being out in the wild, especially being eaten alive by mosquitoes, but they were the least of her problems out here. She hated the laborious long treks they took through the trees, on their intrepid hiking adventures, where sometimes Ken cut his way through pathways obstructed by thick, overgrown, dense vegetation with a machete. It didn't help that her clothes, of course, would be rudely ripped up by thorns and briars that would stick to her clothes like the ticks on a dog's back. Furthermore, she felt continuously sticky and dirty out here, and knew she looked her very worst, so she refused to allow Ken to take any photographs of her. It was so much better back in Michigan, where she could thoroughly enjoy the benefits of her comfortable, well-upholstered life, which was so much more dignified in every sense of the word than this. Home was a sumptuous, cosy place, where warm water ran out of the taps on demand. There was lighting at the flick of a light switch, television to keep you entertained for all the hours that God sends, Wi-Fi access, and then there was, of course, takeout that you could order without having to lift a single finger. Iris hated cooking with a passion, but more than the cooking itself, she loathed all the cleaning up she was invariably expected to do afterwards. She found the unsightly aftermath of her cooking would predictably leave everything in chaos, almost as if a tornado had quite suddenly hit the kitchen, with unapologetic gale-force winds, leaving it looking like something that would take months to lightly clean up. She didn't know why she was so messy and disordered when it came to cooking, but it was probably because she was so clumsily cack-handed at doing things, like when she was making soup, and always put the liquidizer on without the lid, so that the entire kitchen was dappled with droplets of yellow puree that never saw its way to their dinner plates, as it had been splattered all over the kitchen counter and the backsplashes. It didn't help, of course, that Iris was one of those people that seemed to need to use every available kitchen gadget, bowl, plate and utensil at her disposal. And after her cremated offerings were removed from the oven and dished out on dinner plates that were served to the family, they were barely even edible. So what was the point in her cooking anyway? Iris was sure her husband Ken was stuck in a 1950s time warp, because he believed that it was a woman's responsibility to cook and clean. But out here in the Ozarks, he would sometimes be happy to take over the al fresco cooking opportunities. So maybe some clouds did have a silver lining on them after all. The truth was, Iris was not in a good place in her life right now, and couldn't help feeling oddly resentful towards her husband Ken. She hated coming to the Ozarks for a camping holiday, especially now that 14-year-old Jake would be included on all their trips, and whatever they chose to do together as a family. Iris privately wondered when she would be relieved of the burden of his existence in her life, for in recent months he had become a fixture and fitting that she had not invited happily. Jake was what Iris would describe as an unwanted addition to her family, which had made life with her husband Ken all the more disjointed and topsy-turvy, as everything had lost its smooth, natural, regular rhythm, like when you throw a stone into a large body of water, and there is a ripple effect. The chaos had unapologetically arrived in their lives so abruptly, with no advanced warning or notice, rather like a wild, rampant fire that gets so out of control that you are ill-equipped to extinguish it, try as you might. Nothing had prepared Iris for such upheaval to enter her life. It would seem their nephew, on her husband's side of the family, Jake, had been thrust upon their lives so rudely, like a pair of old slippers that she certainly didn't want to be wearing. Iris knew that she would be the one that would invariably be expected to attend to Jake's every need, while her husband happily sauntered off to his cosy job in the city. She would be the one that would have to pick up Jake from school and make sure he had enough to eat. The last thing she wanted was to become a maternal figure in her nephew's life, but it looked like she had not been given the privilege of choice in the matter. Sometimes you take up responsibilities in life that you never ordered, like when you order chicken chow mein from a Chinese takeaway menu, and they end up delivering you barbecue spare ribs instead. Iris was extremely resentful that Jake had moved into their family home, but she knew there was no way she could refuse him a roof over his head, as that would make her a person with absolutely no heart. Nevertheless, she had made sure that her husband Ken knew exactly how bitter she felt about this new arrangement. If the truth be told, she hadn't stopped sulking since the day that Jake had moved in, like a petulant little girl. She knew she had been pretty obnoxious towards the 14-year-old boy, making him feel exceedingly unwelcome in their cosy home. By speaking to him rather abruptly, and being somewhat aloof and insouciant towards him, as sometimes she took it upon herself to pretend he wasn't even there. She couldn't help herself for behaving so childishly, because she didn't want him buttressing his way into their lives, like a sliced tomato being thrown into a ham and cheese sandwich when you never wanted it in the first place. She felt as if she was walking on eggshells, dealing with an introverted, very demure teenager, who had very little to say for himself. Jake had become to her like the unwanted guest that had long since outstayed his welcome, that you wished had left a long, long time ago. But Iris knew she could never kick him out of their home. He was so young and so desperately needy. Besides anything else, where would the poor boy go? She had not signed up to become a mother of any kind, especially not a stepmother, or in her case an aunt. When she'd married Ken, it had been on the strict understanding that the two of them would never have children. "I'm afraid I don't like children," she had confessed to Ken very candidly, before they even got married, for she certainly didn't want Ken to feel he'd been cheated in his marriage by a woman who didn't want kids. So from the very beginning of their relationship, she was completely transparent and made her position clear, so that there were no murky misunderstandings between the two of them. Ken had been fine about the idea of them not having children together, although if the truth be told, in an ideal, idyllic world, he'd have thoroughly enjoyed the privilege of being a father. But he accepted the fact that in life there were always compromises that needed to be made, especially when you wanted something, and Iris was the light of Ken's life, so whatever this woman wanted, she would invariably get. "My love," he had said, "if I can only have you, and that means having no children, that's more than enough for me." And Ken had meant every word of what he'd said, for he couldn't envisage a life without his beloved Iris. "Let me tell you, Ken, why it is I don't like children," she had told him. "They're expensive, demanding, and not that pleasant to have around, dare I say it. I've learnt a lot from my older sister's mistakes in that regard. I'm very fortunate there's a 10-year age difference between us. My sister Trish, as you well know, has 5 children, and as sweet as her children are, she is utterly miserable. I think if she could live her life all over again and go back in time on one of those time machines, she'd have never had those 5 children. She won't admit that to me, of course, because what mother wants to confess that she's made mistakes? She pretends to be happy, but I can read my sister like a book. She's never looked more miserable in her entire life. It's like she carries the weight of the world on her narrow shoulders, as looking after those kids and their ongoing demands has almost swallowed her alive. I think she's lost her identity along the way. Everything these days revolves around those children of hers. Russell needs a pair of new trainers. Liesel's outgrown her ballet shoes. It goes on and on and on. Don't get me wrong, she loves her children to death. Like every mother does. She's devoted to them. She'd take a bullet for them without hesitation. Of that I'm most sure. But I know deep down in her heart she's nursing a plethora of regrets that she's afraid to openly express, in case people think she's a monster. I think her deepest regret is she wanted to pursue a fine arts degree, you know. But that never happened, because at 19 years old, my sister got pregnant with her first child. She refused to have an abortion because Trish earnestly believes that it's morally wrong to have an abortion. And personally, I agree with her on this one. As a result of this early pregnancy of hers, she married her husband, had the baby, and one baby invariably led to another and another. I guess she had to abandon her dreams of a fine arts degree and focus on raising her children. And once you've had 5 kids, well, there's always room for more, isn't there? That's true, said Ken, laughing. But honestly, 5 kids is a lot, love. If your sister's finding them a handful, I can't say I'm surprised. Having any more is not a good idea, even though her husband told me he'd like a whole football team if he had his way. I think the couple has taken on more than they can chew, especially your sister. But at least they can afford to have children. Some people are not so lucky. Because you're right, kids are expensive. It's not just the money, Ken. Rich or poor, raising kids is a huge responsibility for any parent. I hate to say this, Ken, because it sounds so cruel and unfeeling of me. But I know my sister clandestinely resents her kids. She loves them at the very same time, don't get me wrong. So she's dealing with a mishmash of emotions, from guilt to shame, regret, and yet love and gratitude at the very same time. An incongruous mix, don't you think? My sister's smoking like a chimney these days. It's a nasty, nasty habit. But I think it's a coping mechanism for her. She can't handle being a mother. The other day when I went to visit her, well, she got through an entire box of cigarettes and then burst into tears and told me she doesn't know who she is anymore. And much as she loves her kids, it's become too much for her. I think letting out some of her true repressed feelings that she's kept contained for so long was a release for her. But I've known for a long time how my sister really felt about her life. What did you say to her when she admitted how overwhelmed she had become? Well, what could I say to her? I told her that she needed a husband to take some responsibility around the house and not expect her to do everything on her own, so that she can have some time to herself. I even suggested she should try and sign up for art classes. Do something on her own that she enjoys. You're a very good sister to her, love, and I think you gave her some sound advice. My sister also has her problems. She's a bit overwhelmed with her own life. She'd love to settle down and get married, but I don't know if that's ever going to happen for her. Well, I suppose both of our sisters are a bit overwhelmed, aren't they? But what I'm really trying to say here, Ken, is I don't want Trish's experience to become my sad little story. Luckily, her being older than me by 10 years, I've learned significantly from her mistakes, and that's something I don't regret. I think we're both cut from exactly the same cloth, We're not meant to have children. Don't get me wrong, my sister's a fabulous mother. I'd never take that away from her, not for a second, and she's very good with her children. But she's lost herself along the way, if you know what I mean. I think I do know what you mean, said Ken. It's hard to believe she's 10 years older than you. Sometimes you're the adult in the relationship with her, always giving her very good advice. If it's any consolation, I don't think your sister is alone out there in feeling her children are holding her back. I think there are a lot of people secretly feeling exactly the same way, but not expressing it outwardly. I'm afraid kids, any way you look at it, are a responsibility and an expense. And when you have children of any kind, you have to be sacrificial. You have to think of their needs before your own, because that's the makeup of being a good parent. That's why I don't want kids, Iris had said firmly. I don't want to lose myself along the way, like my sister has done. I don't want my story to become hers. I think having children is not all bad, love, Ken had said with a little hesitancy. I'm in no doubt that such relationships enrich your life significantly and give you great purpose. Children can teach us a lot about ourselves, give us invaluable lessons, and help us to become a whole lot less selfish. And what's so bad about that? Well, don't go there, Ken. There is no persuading me to change my mind. I've learned from my sister's mistakes, and I don't want to make them myself. I don't want children, and that's final, Iris had said so resolutely, in an uncompromising voice. Ken had realized in that moment that Iris was resolutely determined that she wanted to have no children, so he had assured her that he loved her too much to care about whether they had children or not. So he decided he'd get the snip, so there was no danger of her ever becoming pregnant. Iris had been exceedingly grateful towards Ken for loving her enough to put her over and above having children of their own. Yet despite her husband's resolute promises, she had not prepared herself for taking on somebody else's child, and a teenager at that. Let's not kid, it was tough enough looking after your own flesh and blood, but a child who had no biological connection to you, except through marriage alone, was a monumental challenge that Iris did not want to undertake. Jake was a sweet enough 14-year-old boy, of course. None of this was his fault. But feeling sorry for the young man didn't help anyone, and she really didn't want him around. She knew Jake had picked up on her unfriendly vibes. Iris was not good at hiding her emotions like that. She'd always worn her heart on her sleeve. So when she was unhappy about something, you pretty much knew all about it. Indeed, Iris was so expressive that when Ken knew his wife was a little niffed about something, he chose to give her a wide berth, because Iris, when she was upset, would often go into quite the sulk, and being around her in that rather desolate, petulant mood was never pleasant. "Jake has got nowhere else to go, love," Ken had told his wife, when discussing the impending fate of his nephew. He knew only too well that the last thing that Iris wanted was a young teenager thrust on their hands, rather like a large bill in the post that they didn't want to pay. But he knew he couldn't turn his back on the only member he had left in his family, especially one so young and vulnerable, such as Jake. "We have to take him in, love," he told Iris apologetically. "If we don't take charge over him, he'll be put into a care system, and he's my sister's boy, which makes him our nephew. Surely you don't want that for him. Do you realize what it does for a kid to be put into care? It can destroy a child emotionally for life, and some of those foster homes, I hate to tell you, love, can do a great deal of damage, and I'm talking about serious damage here. You hear dreadful stories, don't you, of kids being physically abused or verbally abused. They're both pretty bad, and I don't want that for my nephew. I feel responsible for him. I hope you can understand that, love." "Surely there are some decent people out there that would gladly take Jake in," said Iris, desperate to find a solution to a problem that seemed to be growing bigger by the second, like a rising piece of expanding dough on the kitchen counter that had got way too out of control. "You know as well as I do, Ken, that not all foster parents are monsters as you're painting them out to be. There are very good people out there who are excellent in looking after children, and furthermore enjoy having them around. I'm sorry, Ken, I'm not one of them. I'm not cut out to be a maternal figure in a 14-year-old boy's turbulent life. Need I remind you that teenagers are the very worst? I told you categorically when we got married I didn't want children. And if Jake moves in with us, in effect, we become his foster parents. That is the brutal truth, any way you look at it, Ken. We cannot sugarcoat it. We will be entirely responsible for the young man, feeding him, paying his school fees, buying his clothes, taking him to the dentist and doctor, paying for his extracurricular activities, lifting him to and from school. It's a hell of a lot of responsibility, and I didn't sign up for any of this." Ken had become irate with his wife's heartless insensitivity. He glared at Iris through wide, indignant eyes. He was unable to comprehend why his wife was being so hard-hearted and so cruelly cold. He knew his nephew was suffering desperately from the tragic loss of his mother, yet Iris failed to appreciate how lonely and lost Jake had become. The poor kid was traumatized, and understandably so, even though he hid it well behind his polite, very well-mannered exterior. Ken could see that although Jake was being stoically courageous, keeping his emotions in check, it was clear the melancholia in his blue eyes was plain to see. It had hurt him to the quick, realizing this poor young kid was going through so much internal turmoil, and was facing this adversity on his own, rather like an individualized soul journey that only he could undertake. Ken was not the kind of person who knew how to express his emotions freely. Much like his nephew Jake, he was also introverted and demure. So all he'd been able to say to his nephew after his sister had died was, "I'm very sorry, son. We will take good care of you from now on." I mean, what else could Ken actually say? Iris had never seen her husband Ken look so aggrieved as he did right now, as he glared at her furiously. "You think I signed up for this, do you, Iris?" "I'm not saying you did," said Iris in quick defence. "Let's get this straight, Iris, so there is no misunderstanding between the two of us. I don't want to take on my sister's teenager any more than you do. I didn't want any of this to happen, but sometimes in life it throws you a curveball, and you have to deal with it one way or another. Sometimes you have to do the right thing, even if it's uncomfortable to do. I know I faithfully promised you we wouldn't have children of our own, and I've kept to that promise. But I never predicted all this happening, did I?" "I never said you predicted this, Ken, but it's happened, hasn't it?" "That's right, Iris, it's happened. I couldn't put it better myself. The milk has been spilt, and we have to clear the mess up. Nobody else is going to do it. Jake is a young, impressionable teenager. He's a well-behaved, very quiet young man. I'm sure he won't be a lot of trouble for us, but he needs a safe, secure and loving home, and we are all he's got. Do you really want to abandon him? Think about what that poor young man has been going through before you think of yourself. He's lost his mother, for God's sake. He's all on his own in this world. Can you imagine how lost, alone and isolated he must be feeling at such an age as this, when his hormones are flying all over the place? I can't imagine how tough things are for him at the moment. My heart physically bleeds for the young man. To lose your mother at 14 years old has got to be a rough road to find yourself on, any way you look at it." "I don't dispute that things are tough for Jake, but I can't believe this is happening to us," Iris snorted angrily, thrusting a hand on her hip and giving Ken a dagger-like glare. "You think Jake's not going to be any trouble to us? Do you really? All teenagers are trouble. If you don't know that, Ken, you're completely delusional. I'm quite sure both you and I, when we were the same age as Jake is now, caused our parents a great deal of grief, because it goes with the territory of being a teenager. I certainly do not want a teenager moving into our life right now. But I can see the way things are heading, and I don't like it at all. I like things the way they are right now. Ken, I just don't want things to change. Surely someone else would be willing to adopt him. Why do we have to take the young man in?" "I don't want Jake here any more than you do, love," said Ken, his voice firm and resolute, as if there was no negotiations on this matter, as he had decided very firmly what needed to be done as the head of the household, and there was no wiggle room for his wife at all. "I didn't have a clue any of this would happen to us, Iris, but it did. What you've got to realise is that in life you have to face the reality that circumstances invariably change, just like the weather does. Nothing in this life is rigidly set in stone." "I wish to God it was," said Iris. "Life would be so much easier if you knew what was lurking around the next corner. I never predicted any of this." "I understand how you feel, love. But you've got to realise that Jake is our nephew. We cannot throw him to the wolves, can we? My sister would be devastated if I was to abandon her child. She would hope we would both take care of him if anything were to happen to him. I'd like to remind you that I'm not just Jake's uncle, but I'm also his godfather. I remember my sister told me that if anything bad were to happen to her, that she would feel extremely confident that I would take Jake under my wing. Of course, I assured her at the time that I would do just that, never believing for a second any of this would happen. Now I feel compelled to keep my word. But I would regardless take my nephew in, because it's the right thing for us to do." "Your sister should have thought of Jake's welfare before she selfishly took that overdose of pills. What on earth was she thinking, doing such a stupid, senseless thing?" said Iris indignantly. The frustration in her voice was heavily pronounced. "I mean, how selfish can you get? How inconsiderate! I'm sure she knew that if she did herself in, that Jake would be left to fend for himself. She abandoned him. Do you think she assumed you would just take care of him for her? And so she felt resolved of any responsibility towards her own child, and just swallowed a whole bunch of pills for the hell of it?" "I'm sure it was not like that, love," said Ken defensively. Tina was a complicated soul. I don't think she took her own life deliberately to burden us. She was a kind soul. I guess she got overwhelmed by the burden of the pain she was going through at the time, and it was all too much for her. She couldn't see a way out of her grief. Rather like a bee landing in a bowl of honey, and knowing that there is no way of escape. Well, I suppose that's a good way to put it, Ken. And I do understand what you're trying to say. But I hate to burst your bubble, but I'm going to say it regardless. Sometimes people who commit suicide think of nobody else but themselves. They don't care about the people they leave behind, the hearts they break along the way, the hurt, the chaos, and the upheaval they cause. You've lost your sister, Ken, and our nephew Jake has lost a beloved mother. What your sister so callously did was selfish, utterly and totally selfish. Did she rarely stop to think about Jake for a single second? Didn't she realize he'd suffer if she left him to fend for himself? Like those deranged, heartless people who drop their dogs off in the middle of nowhere, leaving those frightened animals to fend for themselves. I've seen people like that, doing these kind of dreadful things on YouTube videos. It's horrifying and disgusting what some people do. They shirk their responsibilities and leave someone else to clean up the mess after them. I do understand what you're saying, love. But try not to be so hard on Tina. My sister was in a dark, desolate place in that bleak, hopelessly obscure moment. Nothing about the way she took her life was premeditated. I don't think she thought much about what she did. She'd been living with Pierre for 5 years, and when she suddenly discovered he was cheating on her, it was all too much. She really thought he was the one for her, the one who would marry her and adopt Jake. When she discovered he was messing her around, when her back was turned, well, it broke her heart. She couldn't cope with the pain of discovering the man that she loved was not that into her after all. And maybe in that moment, the burden of this hostile revelation became all too much, and in a moment of impulse she swallowed all those tablets. These things can happen, you know. That's so pathetic, said Iris, rolling her eyes. Honestly, think about it, Ken. Your sister swallows a bunch of pills because her boyfriend cheated on her. How many people have discovered their partners are cheating on them? It happens to thousands of people all over the globe. But they don't just swallow a whole bunch of pills to escape their internal turmoil, do they? They pick up the forlorn pieces of their life, like you do after you break a glass, and get on with things. Yes, it's devastating when someone's doing the dirty on you. Yes, it hurts a whole lot. I'm the first that can testify to that, because I've been cheated on myself. I was so angry with that boyfriend of mine when I was at university and discovered he was having a relationship with one of my girlfriends. And neither of us knew we were both being played. And in that moment of cruel discovery, I felt as if someone had walloped me across the head with a pickaxe. But I had to just bear the burden of that pain and get on with my life as you do. You don't crumble at the first hurdle, do you? One day my boyfriend was enjoying a redhead, and the next day he was enjoying me, the brunette. I wouldn't have been surprised if there was a blonde lurking in the background somewhere. I wanted to box his ears and key his car, and my only regret is I didn't do either of those things. Just so you know, even when I've hit rock bottom in my life, and that has happened more times than I care to mention, just like any other human being on this planet, I've been in dark, very lonely places before. But I'll tell you this, Ken. No matter how low I felt, I'd never go and swallow a bunch of pills just because I felt so desperately sorry for myself or thought I couldn't cope. Good, I'm glad to hear it, love. I couldn't bear to lose you. You are a tough woman. Even if you were to hit rock bottom, you'd definitely move on with your life without so much as looking back. You wouldn't dwell on your grief or pain, but you're a survivor, Iris. You've got a steely grit and a strong, courageous personality. You're a determined woman, but not everyone, I'm afraid to say, is built with your stoic reserves. Some of us are easily fractured and are more inclined to become unhinged. Tina, I'm afraid, was one of those unfortunate people. Well, think about it, Ken. The idea of committing suicide because someone has hurt you is ridiculous. Furthermore, if I had a 14-year-old teenager, I'd hope I'd feel some level of responsibility in looking after him and putting his needs over and above my own. But your sister, no, she did nothing of the kind. She selfishly, very inconsiderately, wallowed in her own lugubrious melancholia, forgetting about her own son. How selfish can you get? I'm still unable to get over this. I don't mean to keep on harping on about it, but it's just incomprehensible to me that a mother could do this to her own teenager. It makes no sense to me at all. Look, Irish, you well know Tina was not built like other people. She was uniquely different in every way. She wasn't wired like us. Even to look at, she's always been as delicate as a butterfly. She was always ethereal, almost as if she came from a much gentler planet than Earth itself, and never really belonged here. Let's not kid. This world can be a very brutal place. Tina was the kind of person that could easily get crushed, like when you tear the wings off a delicate dragonfly and watch it struggle to fly. She was very fragile. So very fragile. I do remember when my mother was alive, she used to say that Tina was far too sensitive for this earth, and I believe she was right on that. My mother used to worry tirelessly about Tina's future, and how she would cope when she got older, because she was so easily hurt. I do remember once when my mother was reading us a story when we were both children. It was called The Princess and the Pea. I think the book was first published in 1835, if I remember correctly. It was a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale about a princess who is able to prove her nobility by sensing an uncooked pea lying under a pile of mattresses. The princess couldn't sleep because that tiny little pea caused her so much extreme discomfort, almost as if she was lying on a glass shard. That was how sensitive and delicate the princess was, and Tina was built much the same. Sensitive souls like Tina are ill-equipped for life on this earth, and they find it so difficult to cope, so much so that they often take their own lives. The world is a hostile place to live in, which is why some people turn to drugs and alcohol, to numb the pain, and to help them bravely soldier on, from one day to the next, almost as if they're getting ensnared in their own personal war that they happen to be fighting. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.